Greetings from the brother from Harlem with high school education, also known as Jim McFarland, aka Gentleman Jim. I'm going to tell you how Harlem was growing up in what I call the magical years of Harlem. Now that's from the 50s, the 60s, and the 70s. I left in the 70s. But before I tell you about my life in Harlem, I'd like to tell you and give you some information on Harlem that you might or might not know. As it stands, Negroes lived in New York for a long time, and we lived all over New York. Not Harlem at first, but we lived all over New York. Bronx, Brooklyn, you name it, upstate, over here, over there. Harlem came about, and you could look at it through many different eyes and lenses and see. The first settlement in Harlem, believe it or not, was in 1825 by free slaves that moved into some wasteland that they could buy. And they created a little village there called Seneca Village. Outside of Seneca Village, the majority of your Negroes, now we didn't own anything, we lived on the Lower West Side in what's called the Chelsea area. Now this is an area over by the Hudson River in the teens. Well, that's where all the docks were down in that side of Manhattan back then. And the jobs that Negroes got in those days were just common laborer jobs, the real blood, sweat, and tears. So we kind of settled in that little area because we couldn't settle anywhere else. They were already settled. You had Little Italy, Chinatown, Germantown, you had where the Polish people lived, you had everything. Harlem, mind you, was settled by the Jewish and the Irish Catholics. That's who lived in Harlem, the poor ones. And there was a handful of Negroes there and a handful of Hispanics there and a handful of this and a handful, like a melting pot, whereas all the other communities were their communities. And if you were not one of them, you couldn't live there back then. So you had one little community back in the day where free slaves lived, where the Negroes lived, and they settled Seneca Village. But then in 1859, they wanted to build a park. So they displaced the Negroes, and they just told them you had to leave. Even though they owned the land, you just have to leave. That became Central Park, is what we know today. But that was the only Negro settlement that we had, and it was in the wasteland. So we didn't really have anything. We lived down on the Lower West Side. Now, how did we get to Harlem? Well, it's very simple. We had a little area that we lived in on the Lower West Side, and after World War I, when more and more Negroes were leaving the South, coming north, they started going into that area that I'm talking about, the Chelsea area on the Lower West Side. Got too many of us there. So the white landlords just told us point blank, pack your bags and leave. We were displaced also from where we lived, just like Seneca Village was many, many years earlier than us. They decide they want to do something, they just tell you to pack your bags and leave. So we started moving more and more into Harlem, which, like I told you, was mainly Jewish and Irish Catholic that were living there. So as more and more of us lived and moved in there and started to live there, they had the projects. Projects were not built for us, they were built for them. We just inherited that. So as more and more of us moved from the South to New York, Harlem became the largest concentrations of Negroes in the North. Now the whites moved further north in Manhattan. Manhattan is an island, so they moved further up. The Irish Catholics settled in an area called Washington Heights, and the Jewish community lived on just the other side of Washington Heights. The Jewish community that settled up there developed the university called Yeshiva University, which is a Jewish university. I don't know if it's the only one in America or if it was even the first, but Yeshiva was there. See, I lived in all of those areas, so that's why I know a lot. When my family moved to Harlem, I didn't even know what it was, but that's where the settlement of my people ended up. And with that said, after World War II, which was the late teens, by the time we got into 1920, Harlem was overrun with blacks, Negroes as we were called in those days. And we started expressing ourselves through song and dance and art and all kind of music, creating a renaissance of cultural affairs. They named it the Harlem Renaissance. We had nowhere else to go. It had to be the Harlem Renaissance. And the name has stuck, and I'm proud of it because it showed that we were capable of doing more, especially from an artistic standpoint, than just, I guess you could say, low-rung jobs. And that's how Harlem was developed. Not because we had it, we inherited it. So as I look back on New York and what it was, I did research on it. I found some things to give me a better handle on what it was. These things were written not by me, but it gave me a lot of facts and a lot of information. One of the books that I picked up is called The Black New Yorker. Now this gives you a history of the blacks that lived all over New York, not just Harlem, even though it concentrates a lot on Harlem, but it showed different areas of where we lived and how we lived. It talks about what we did back in those days. But it's a very good book for reference on New York and Harlem. The other book is called Harlem on My Mind. Okay, this is a book I picked up many years ago also when I was doing research on Harlem, because by living in Harlem and I moved out of Harlem, I wanted to know more about it. What I'm about to tell you on this new YouTube channel that I started called The Brother from Harlem with the high school education. Excuse me. I'm going to talk about my growing up in Harlem, what Harlem was like in the 50s, 60s, and the beginning of the 70s. We'll talk about my life. Now, this is factual. This is how I lived it. This is how the people really lived back in the days. There's a lot of myths about Harlem. All of them are true. And I just want to set the record straight on what I know, what I saw, what I lived, and what the older generation of my people told me. Now, I have to believe them because they're the generation that was right before when all this Renaissance was happening. So they lived that part. I didn't. But back in those days, it's just like any other tale that people would tell you how people lived. So I have to say that it was accurate enough because as I looked around at my living in Harlem, my working in Harlem, my being in Harlem, it couldn't be but what it was. I read all about the early pioneers of Harlem, the things that went on in the 20s, in the 30s, and in the 40s. That's what they told me. Now I was born in the 40s, but I moved to Harlem in 1954. So I got a good first-hand look at what Harlem was about. The Brother from Harlem will tell you about my life growing up in New York, Harlem and other areas, and how I went to high school. And I took a high school education and maximized it because it created what is now known as Gentleman Jim. But I never forget my roots. I'm just a brother from Harlem with a high school education. This is Jim McFarland, the brother with the high school education. Tune into my channel, and every week I'm going to give you a little more about Harlem so you get a better understanding because it's changed so much. And I want those that didn't know what it was like to get my perspective on it. It's not hearsay. It's not what people say it was, or all the misnomers about Harlem, the stigmatism that was placed on Harlem. They all aren't true. Harlem was just another neighborhood, no different than Chinatown, Polishville, Little Italy, Washington Heights, no different. It's just people. So that's what I want to get you guys up on it. Be talking to you soon. The brother from Harlem with the high school education. Thank you very much.